Hey folks, George here again. Today we're going to read another work of Japanese literature. This time we're going to read an essay that was transcribed from a speech by Kishida Toshiko. The essay is entitled Daughters in Boxes. I found this essay in an anthology by scholar Rebecca Copeland entitled Modern Murasaki. I was really interested in that book, that whole anthology, just because it is one of the first, if not the first, anthology of solely women writers from Meiji Era Japan. And here, the one that I've selected to focus upon today is this one by Kishida named Daughters in Boxes. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about all of the same 8 questions that I typically talk about in these sorts of discussions, starting with number 1, who are the characters? Why are they interesting? What's the setting? Why is it interesting? What is the plot, or in this case, the thesis, and why is it interesting? And what are the themes, and why are they interesting? In addition, we'll talk about the other things, such as the structural and formal details of the text. Then we'll also talk about intertextual details. We'll talk about history. And finally, we'll talk about my own concerns and my own thoughts on this thing, how it connected to me personally. How to start off then? We'll talk about Kishida herself, because clearly she's the author of this essay, and she's talking about herself, isn't she? Or actually, is she talking about the daughters in boxes? Who are these daughters that she's talking about? It's the editor of the book. It's her position that she's talking about literally all the daughters of Japan. What does that mean? That means females. She's talking about females. So we could talk about Kishida as a very early Japanese feminist in Meiji Era Japan, because this is an essay that's geared towards and about females in Japan in this Meiji era, right? She's obviously talking about herself too. She is a very popular, Kishida is, a very popular figure in women's literature in Meiji Era Japan, and also a vanguard, we might say, of women's rights in Japan. What do I mean by a vanguard? Well, she influenced so many other people after her, right? Many of these Japanese feminist writers, feminist thinkers, talk about Kishida and cite her as an influence, right? It's because she was the first who wanted to really speak out and put herself on the line, literally, in fact, put herself on the line in advocating for women's rights. As such, this is a political speech. After all, asking for equal rights or equality or special accommodations or equal accommodations for women, namely around the area of education, right, is a political speech. And when I say that she put herself on the line, she was arrested for this speech and many others as well. So clearly, we could see a little bit about the history of Meiji Era Japan, such that political speech was not free. Certainly not free in the way that we would consider free speech in America, at least. Free political speech. We very recently, in 2020, we see lots of political protests speaking out about all sorts of things. I don't want to talk about any of those protests. However, I only bring them up to contrast them with Kishida in Meiji Era Japan, and she's simply talking about something like equal rights for women, and she gets locked up. So clearly, even though Meiji Era Japan was fighting for modernization, both technologically, scientifically, but also politically. After all, the Meiji era ushered in the parliamentary diet, which is a democratic system. Yet, obviously, it wasn't as democratic as we might consider it today, such that women didn't have equal rights and political speech was regulated. So, those are some things to keep in the back of our minds as we understand this speech, but also the rest of Meiji Era Japan as well. What is the setting then? So this is Meiji Era. I've talked about that. Setting and history are going to go together right now, aren't they? So we are in Japan during the Meiji Era, and that has all sorts of political implications. I've just explained that it is the era of modernization, not just technologically speaking, but also politically speaking. And Kishida is one of these vanguards, I'll say, that is speaking out for political equality for a very specific group, women in her case. What is her thesis then? Or what is the plot of this essay? What is the thesis of her essay? I think it's fairly simple. She's really advocating for education as a way for women to grow, to flourish in society. Now, we'll talk about what she means by flourishing in a little bit, because it might not be exactly how I, in the year 2020, see flourishing individuals and the fight for women's equality. So another aspect of the setting here is the time, Meiji Era, I just said. However, when in the Meiji Era is this speech given? Well, the editor of this book here suggests that it is October 12th, 1883. That's very early in the Meiji Era. This is still the 19th century then, when she's speaking out for women's rights. To put that in a little bit of context, 1883 is even before American women had the right to vote. You'll remember, actually, we just celebrated the 100th anniversary, didn't we, of the 19th Amendment to the American Constitution, which was passed ultimately in 1920. So this is almost 40 years before American women even have the right to vote. So with that in mind, we want to put this in a little bit of historical context and understand how she speaks about women's equality and helping women flourish. I think this will be very important for us to keep in the back of our minds as we read this, because it's slightly different from what we might think in the year 2020. So then, what is she really talking about with her themes? Let's talk about the themes then. Obviously, I've said over and over again that she's really talking about feminism. She's really talking about women's rights and women's equality, right? But she's focusing narrowly on one specific flavor of women's rights and women's equality, and she really wants to focus on education in this essay. Many of us believe that education is going to be the key to flourishing. Now, does that mean a formal college education or things like that? I certainly don't believe that, but I do believe we need some sort of education. I think each of us, all of us, everywhere, needs some kind of education to help us flourish and grow and meet the potentiality that we all have within us. So some kind of education is going to be valuable for any of us to flourish, whether it's a college education, whether it's an apprenticeship or a trade or something along those lines. We all need to learn something in order to flourish and reach our potential, right? The other thing that's interesting here is that she does talk about freedom and liberty specifically. Those are very interesting words to be talking about and using in Japan in 1883. Right? Let's turn the page to page 62, please. The inconvenience of tonight's rain-congested thoroughfares may just be the conduit to tomorrow's easy passage. And this is the valuable part. Today's lack of freedom just may become the catalyst for tomorrow's liberty. Those are two key words that she uses right there. Today, we lack freedom. And she's got a problem with that. And why does she have a problem with that? Because she wants tomorrow to gain liberty. Those are very Western ideals, aren't they? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit and how she incorporates these Western ideals of freedom and liberty. But she talks very specifically saying, we lack freedom today, and perhaps, so her hope is, tomorrow we will gain liberty to, of course, reach our flourishing potential. Here on page 67, she also talks about freedom and liberty in a very interesting way, which really shows some intertextual connections as well. Let's see this intertextual connection that she brings up here on page 67. But now that our daughters know perfectly well that God the Creator has endowed them with liberty, we ought to be constructing boxes that permit them their liberty. That's very interesting to me because, like I said, I hear all sorts of intertextual connections, especially with a reference to God, the Creator. who is endowed liberty. What does that sound like to you? That, by the way, I don't remember reading anything like that in the Kojiki or Tale of Genji or any of the other pre-modern Japanese works. When I hear that God, the Creator, has endowed us all with liberty, Kishida here sounds like the founding fathers of America in the Declaration of Independence, where it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't think it's an accident at all that Kishida, in her own essay, in her own speech here on page 67, she says, we all know that God, the Creator, has endowed us with liberty, and therefore we should get rid of these boxes or have boxes that permit us our liberty. I think this shows very clearly that Kishida is educated not just by the Eastern classics of Confucianism and such, but she's also acquainted with these Western Enlightenment philosophies that lead to the American Declaration of Independence, almost more than 100 years earlier. And to really go on with this inequality theme, she doesn't exactly say the word inequality, but what does she say back on page 63 now? It is only for daughters that such boxes are constructed. What is she implying right there? We women are being treated unequally. Men don't have these boxes. Women have these constraining boxes that hold us back, that keep us from education and all the rest, including infringing on our God-endowed liberty. What I love here, though, is that Kishida is not merely a Western or European or American acolyte. She is well aware of the Eastern tradition. She was very well versed in Confucian teachings. And so she knows other kinds of philosophies as well. And what's interesting about that is, despite the fact that she is talking about liberty and freedom and inequality and equality, right? She's also talking about the nation. So if we look at the top of page 63 also, she does say what she is doing is for the sake of our country. That all that she's doing as writing, as entertainment, she calls it, in quotes there, entertainment. Surely it's not inappropriate to say, therefore, that my entertainment benefits the country. So she's reminding us that she's not doing this as a totally selfish endeavor, but she is in tune with these Confucian ideologies as well, and Confucian philosophy that says, wait a second, we are a strong community like this. And I love the logic that she's using right here. She's very well aware of her audience, the Japanese people, the Japanese government, those in power. She's very well aware of the values that they hold too. And I find that amazingly fascinating that she is using their own philosophy to try to prove her point. By the way, if you let women out of these boxes, if you let our daughters out of boxes, this will benefit the country. You want that, don't you? I want that too. Let me help you. Some of these Western ideals like liberty and education and equality are good for the country. And that's why I love it. Because she's not just trying to speak, hey, you listen to me. I've got a better idea than the rest of y'all. Rather, she's saying, I understand what you want. I want to help you get what you want, which is a strong country. To get a strong country, give people like me liberty and education. Because that will make our country strong. That will benefit our whole country. And that's why I love Kishida as a thinker, as an arguer, as a debater. Because she's using people's own ideas, the dominant patriarchy, if you want to call it that, in Japan during the Meiji Era, saying, I know what you want, And I'm giving you what you want, even within the confines of your own philosophy. And old school Confucianism, by the way, too. And I find that brilliant on her part. Brilliant on her part. So let's talk about the text now, or the formal elements of the text. Well, the most obvious thing that jumps out at us is her metaphor of boxes, right? Daughters in boxes. What do the boxes mean, right? Well, the boxes are clearly a metaphor. And that metaphor carries out throughout the whole essay, right? Throughout the whole essay. And she describes what she means by boxes on page 63. But to turn to the topic of this evening's lecture, the expression daughters in boxes is a popular one heard with frequency in the regions of Kyoto and Osaka. It is the daughters of middle-class families and above who are often referred to as such. Why such an expression? Because these girls are like creatures kept in a box. They may have hands and feet and a voice, but all to no avail, because their freedom is restricted. Unable to move, their hands and feet are useless. Unable to speak, their voice has no purpose. Hence the expression. She spells out perfectly for us exactly what she means by this metaphor. That women all over Japan, especially in the middle and upper classes, are being kept in boxes. Restricted. You're giving them hands and feet and letting them talk, but why? After all, they're in boxes. They're like in a cage. That reminds me of Maya Angelou, doesn't it? I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, where Maya Angelou uses the metaphor of a cage that she feels trapped in, that other women feel trapped within. Well, so much earlier than Maya Angelou, here's Kishida using not a cage metaphor, but a box metaphor to say, look at how we're restricted. For a box with walls visible to the human eye is cramped and does not allow one to cultivate truly bright and healthy children. But then she describes her own version of a box, the box that she prefers the daughters of Japan have. A little bit further down. My box without walls is made of heaven and earth. Its lid I would fashion out of the transparent blue of the sky, and its bottom would be the fathomless depths of the earth upon which we stand. My box would not be cramped. So she wants a box without walls, a box that has the sky as the ceiling. She wants women in Japan to be free. And then at the top of the very next page, she continues on what this box literally. She moves from the metaphor of the box to what she literally means. Constructing this box is above all a woman's task, and an important task at that. A hastily made box will not do. A woman should carry with her into marriage a box filled with good education, and that will bring her good character. So there we've moved from the box metaphor that the daughters of Japan are kept in. And she says, in order to give them the box with sky and earth as its walls, we need to move from that metaphor to literally a good education. She wants to educate Japanese women and give women an education so with which they can flourish. However, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky for me, sitting in New York City in the year 2020. She again uses what I called brilliant a moment ago. She uses these old-fashioned and traditional values to try to prove her point, right? And I found that to be brilliant. But here, it starts to get a little bit odd for me sitting here in 2020 New York City. How so? A little bit further down on page 64. Far better to build the box before the birth of the child. For indeed, a woman's ability to produce good children for the propagation of the family and to encourage domestic harmony depends on how carefully she has built this box. This box of education, of course. This box with the sky as walls. However, what's the purpose that Kishida is saying that we need to educate Japanese women? She's saying so that they could get married and have children and be good mothers. Now, you'll forgive me in 2020. God bless you if you do want to have children and get married and raise a wonderful family. Nothing wrong with that. However, in my flavor of feminism, that is even still a little constricting, isn't it? Must a woman get married? Must a woman have a family? Must a woman raise children? Kishida, of course, is living in 1883, speaking this in 1883. Here I am, more than 100 years later, 140 years later, almost. And I'm thinking, do you need to get married? Do women need to get married? Do women need to have kids? Now, there's a couple of ways to think about Kishida's, what I'm going to call old-fashioned style feminism. A feminism that says, hey, we want women to be successful mothers and raise a family. Let me think of two ways we could think of this. Number one, she might be thinking, listen, she's in 1883 and we have to forgive her for having such a limited outlook on women's opportunities in the year 1883 in Meiji Era Japan, right? Maybe it's unfair of me to say, hey, a woman should be able to not get married, not have children, and go be successful and flourish in any way that she chooses. It's quite possible that Kishida, living in 1883, can't conceive of a flourishing life for a woman outside of a family. That's possible. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that she does actually want more for women than merely to be mothers and the caretakers of families. However, she can't speak that, and she knows she can't speak that. And just like earlier, what I praised earlier as her position of brilliantly using the dominant male ideals and saying we want to educate women so that this can be better for the country, I'm wondering if she's trying to stick with that sort of framework so that she can convince her political opponent to say, wait a second, I want to work with you, so therefore, wouldn't more educated women be better mothers? Right? So she might just be thinking, I've got to convince the opponent, the political opponent. Of course, she might, without speaking it out loud, consider that women can flourish beyond a family, beyond the family life. But she's not saying that right here because she does want to convince the rest of Japan of this position, and to go and be so radical doesn't convince anybody, does it? I think we get certain challenges today. We understand that challenge today, don't we? Where the extremes on either side of the political spectrum never really work together at all because they're so extreme. And perhaps Kishida is brilliant here in that she doesn't want to be overly extreme, right? Or maybe it's a combination of both of those. I'm not sure. I think that there's a lot of room for discussion there. What do you think? Why is Kishida narrowly focused on women within the family role? I think that's a good topic for further discussion, yes? I've already mentioned a couple of intertextual connections here, certainly including European and American Enlightenment ideals regarding equality and inalienable rights, and how God the Creator has endowed these rights. I mentioned the Declaration of Independence is a specific one. So we can move on from there. I've also mentioned the era that we're in, the history of the era that we're in, Meiji Japan, which is modernizing, and all sorts of political upheaval is happening, including equality for all people. And Kishida is just trying to speak up for women as well. If we're giving equal rights to all people or all men, why not extend that to women as well, right? And by the way, this isn't a completely novel idea. They were certainly having these sorts of debates in Europe, in America, and in other places around the world as well. And that helps us kind of contextualize her speech here. How do I feel? Let's talk about my own personal connection to this essay. Of course, I would consider myself a feminist. I've got no problem saying that. That said, however, I hope that we recognize that there's all sorts of different flavors of feminism, right? There are feminists who debate with each other, of course, about what feminism means. Even today, especially today, we get a lot of that. So as a feminist, I think that, I could simply and very easily say, yes, I believe in equal rights for women. And there might be a further debate about what equal rights for women really means. And I think that's what I'm fascinated by in this particular essay, is what exactly does equal rights for women mean for Kishida? Is she really thinking about, or is she stuck in her own box of 1883 Japan, such that she can't think beyond the family life for the flourishing life of a woman? I don't know, right? I could think that. By the way, I think that that family life is and can be a very flourishing life for a woman in 2020 New York and everywhere else around the world. I also think that's not the only way to have a flourishing life as a woman. And I think that's where the question is for me, right? However, again, I really like her debate tactics and her logical and critical thinking skills here to really take it to her political opponent and say something like, wait a second, you want good for the country, don't you? Give women rights. That's good for the country. I love how she says, by the way, you want women to be good mothers, don't you? Give women education. That will make them good mothers and good caretakers for the family. So I love how she's using the dominant logic to prove her own point of expanding women's rights. And I would love rather, that more of that kind of debate would happen today, as opposed to simply political debate speaking past each other, not even noticing what other people are trying to say, right? I definitely prefer that we recognize what goals we do have in common and try to work within those goals. And I find Kishida brilliant in exploiting that technique of political debate. You want this, don't you? So do I. This is how we can get it. Don't you agree? And how could you disagree with her, of course? Well, they did, and they threw her in jail. But I think Japan and the rest of the world is much better today, and women all over the world, in Japan, America, and elsewhere, are better off today because of Kishida and women like her. That's it for today. See you later. Bye-bye.